Good morning. Welcome to another episode of the Electric Bison on this fine Montana day. Back in the early 1900s in Butte, Montana, the Anaconda Company and the people that lived there had a tough time. There were a lot of riots, a lot of people hurt, a lot of people killed. And that's basically because things operated by jungle rules. Then, after the 1934 Labor Relations Act, things started to settle down into some kind of a rhythm. And so that by 1951, at least, when the last man was killed, being crushed by a cage coming up out of the Stewart mine, his family got a little bit of a settlement, not much, but at least it was something compared with what it had been back earlier in the century. Well, I think there's a lot to be learned from that we all can do a little bit better if we don't operate by jungle rules. The problem I'm having right now is that our Congress is operating with jungle rules. There's been a great effort to not do away with the filibuster requirement, Rule 22 it's called, that requires 3/5 of the senators to vote to shut down debate on an issue. I agree with that. I used to be Speaker of the House here in Montana, and both Robert's Rules of Order and Mason's Rules for Legislative Procedure, they all require 2/3 vote to shut down debate after a question's been called. That's fair. It allows everyone to have a chance to say their piece. However, what's taken place in the Congress is what's called a Congressional Budget Reconciliation, and that's how the big beautiful bill passed. It passed as a Budget Reconciliation Act. And the way that's supposed to work is the Senate sends out a resolution with mention of what each committee is expected to do, and then each committee does their thing. It comes together in a package, and then the whole package gets voted on up or down as a budget reconciliation. And the rule has always been that you use the legal baseline. In other words, what are the laws that we have to continue implementing that are in place right now, and what is it going to cost? The budget resolution that went to the Senate Finance Committee, where Steve Daines is a member, allowed them to have a $1.5 trillion increase in the deficit. I find that peculiar because by the time the Senate Finance Committee moved forward with its law, Steve Daines, with its part of the law, to do with cutting back our tax base by $5 trillion, and thereby reducing our income to our federal government by $1.5 trillion. Steve Daines had changed the current law baseline approach to current policy. In other words, his argument was, well, our policy is to have a tax reduction. If we just keep it going the way it's been, that's current policy, that's good enough. Well, unfortunately, the deficit doesn't really operate that way. When they extended the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act permanently, for the next 10 years, it means another huge increase in our deficit. And then to make up for that, the exact amount was taken out of the hides of Montanans and other Americans. It was taken out in the way of reducing Medicare, about $800 billion, reducing food stamps, about $400 billion, and reducing the adjustment for the increased insurance premiums, the tax deduction for increased insurance premiums for the Affordable Care Act. So that's where the $1.5 billion came from, to offset the reduction in income to our government. Nevertheless, we still have an increase in the deficit. And it troubles me that in addition to that policy change, which wasn't supposed to be allowed under our budget reconciliation rules, there were other changes made to do with student loans being able to go to private colleges, to do with abortion, putting the Hyde Amendment into it, things like that that have nothing to do with the budget. So basically, the Republican leadership snuck by what they wanted, and they called it the Reconciliation Act. So it's jungle rules, right? So what happens when you have jungle rules? The people that have to deal with that use whatever they have at their disposal. And now that I've seen what they've done, what the senators, including particularly Steve Daines, have done, and covered it up really well, because I didn't see it till I started getting up in the night reading about this stuff. The Democrats are well advised to use jungle rules in return and basically stop being a part of a joke. When I was Speaker, I used the rules fairly so that both sides, Republicans and Democrats, knew they would be treated properly by myself and had all the rules that they were entitled to. Never tried to cut corners. And if there was a change in the rules, we did it on the Rules Committee. But the job of the leadership, the prevailing party, which selects the leaders, is to enforce the rules. I'm telling you right now, the Republicans didn't do that. Back in February, which is several months before that budget resolution went to the Senate's Finance Committee that Steve Daines is a key member of, Steve wrote this letter to President Trump. And it already tells me that he had in mind what he was going to do no matter. He said, "Dear Mr. President, you were elected with the mandate to do big things. One of those big things is to provide lasting tax relief for small businesses and families across the country. As members of the Senate Finance Committee, we write to express our support for your position that the expiring provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act must be permanent and not sunset. In other words, not go out after 5 years. After passage of your tax cuts in 2017, we had a booming economy and soaring investments, higher wages, increased productivity, and zero corporate inversions. That may be true, but 8 studies reviewed by the Congressional Research Office indicate that it had nothing to do with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. It had other things, but not that. Without action at the end of this year, taxes will increase for Americans in every income group, and nearly 6 million jobs are at risk." I refer you to the Congressional Research Office findings about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. It basically was a give back to the people that were paying the big money in taxes, people like Steve Daines and our Governor Gianforte. They're the ones that made all the money off of this. A temporary extension of these pro-growth and pro-family policies is a missed opportunity. In other words, 5 years isn't enough. You know, when did people stop learning to say thank you? Businesses need certainty while investing in their companies, and taxpayers should not fear tax hikes due to congressional inaction. Well, I'm telling you what, with Steve Daines wanting to spend $141 billion on the Sentinel program, and Tim Sheehy wanting to spend upwards of $3.5 trillion on the Golden Dome, all for President Trump, there's going to be taxes, trust me. Congressional Republicans have a historic opportunity to enact this lasting tax relief. Failure to act boldly does a disservice to the American people who entrusted us to deliver in November. And here's the final line. Thus, we will not support a tax package that only provides temporary relief from tax hikes. In other words, they weren't going to end the 5-year 2017 tax cuts bill. That was signed by Steve Daines, United States Senator, Mike Crapo, John Thune, United States Senate Majority Leader, John Barrasso, our Senator from Wyoming, the great state of Wyoming, James Langford, Roger Marshall, Tom Tillis, and Marsha Blackburn. Now, there's no Democrats on that, and I'm kind of wondering if they ever had that in a meeting and talked about it, allowed people to say their piece. I doubt it. But they made it permanent when they changed the baseline for the budget bill from current law to current policy. It's a lie. And if we're going to operate with mutual respect, we need to call lies what they are. Thanks.